Now, thank you very much for coming along. This is our information session number 5. The first of the 2 sessions we're holding today. We also have an open day and then another session this evening. So a very busy time for us here as we share some wonderful things that we're doing within housing in this district. So last week we heard about some of the challenges that we're facing with our changing climate, and today we now look a bit closer at some of those demographic trends as well relating to housing and the challenging environment that we face here in the Rotorua district but across the country with our housing crisis. So evidence does show that our city here in Rotorua has a severe lack of homes, and Council is working with urgency to respond to that demand. So as we all know, Rotorua is a growing and changing place, but as we continue to change, we'll need to be ready to act as soon as possible. So that's what we've been doing with the work at the Rotorua Lakes Council. So the good thing is that our community now has the opportunity to plan well for the future that enables us to grow in a way that protects but also enhances those things that we love, the things that make us unique. As we continue to grow though, we are in a good position to learn from not only other cities but also from the work that's happening across the region. And it's really such a pleasure to have our guest speakers here today from across New Zealand to share some of their insights and the work they've been doing too. So Council's role is actually to enable and encourage the growth. So while we may not build homes ourselves, we play a key part in planning for good growth and also in building partnerships, because we must work together in order to solve this big crisis that we have so that we can deliver for what our community needs. So we can't do this alone. We do need to work together to help Rotorua to reach its potential, and we really acknowledge the involvement of our partners and especially mana whenua who work together and bring those values and principles of the Te Aroha iwi. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of our agenda today. So thanks. We'll go to our demographic trends and then also look at the national context. So first up, it's our pleasure to have Natalie Hampson from Market Economics. And Market Economics have worked extensively with us at Council on our housing and business capacity assessment. So Natalie will speak to that in more detail. But Market Economics is a leading independent economic consultancy and research provider, of which Natalie is the director with her experience. So thank you very much for being here with us today. After Natalie, we will then also have Nick, and Nick McNabb is from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. So we'll give us a bit of context to that national picture and the future of urban development across the country. So we'll get straight into it, and I'll hand over to Natalie to introduce herself. Now, please just hold all of your questions until the end of her presentation, and then any questions that you may have of Nick until the end of that, and then we'll open up for wider discussion at the end. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Natalie.
Kia ora everyone, thank you very much for having me here. So as Councillor mentioned, I'm here to talk about demographic trends relating to growth in housing in Rotorua. So Market Economics has been working closely with Council on its Housing and Business Development Capacity Assessment, or what we call an HBA for short. So the HBA is a key document required of the Council under the National Policy Statement of Urban Development. Now with regard to housing, it's a comprehensive assessment of demand, supply and capacity over the short, medium and long term. So my presentation today is sharing the findings of the housing demand analysis that is part of that HBA report, with a focus on projected changes over the long term. So just in terms of my presentation, by the long term, what I'm meaning is the period of time between 2020 and 2050, so a 30-year outlook. So this presentation is essentially a highlights version of those sections of the HBA report. So I'm going to begin with a look at the characteristics of Rotorua's current resident households and how those characteristics are going to change over the long term. Also looking at the amount of household growth expected in the district by 2050 according to a medium growth scenario. And finally, what that means for the future housing demand in Rotorua in order to meet both the needs of current and future community. So what drives housing demand? At its simplest, it's the number of resident households. Now, we make the assumption that one household equals one dwelling. Now, in addition to resident households demand, there's also the housing demand for those wanting a holiday home in Rotorua district and those wanting to offer a whole house Airbnb or book a batch. So we're talking about everything. But my presentation today is going to focus on resident household demand, as housing those that want to live here permanently is the priority, although Council does need to provide and ensure that there is capacity for the whole housing market, including the holiday homes, etc. So once we know how much demand, how much their demand is for resident housing, how do we know what sort of types of housing are needed, as different households have different housing needs and including over their lifetime? This can be informed by demographic data, such as that collected from Statistics New Zealand during the census, and a range of other data sources. There are 4 key variables that determine the nature of housing demand, and these apply in combination. So the first is household type. This data distinguishes one-person households from couple households, two-parent and single-person households, as well as multi-family households and non-family households. And that last one is really those that are flatting together where the members of the household are not related to each other. So typically, smaller households need smaller dwellings, and families and multi-family households need larger dwellings, although what people need and have is often different because, things don't always work out the way we want them to. The second key variable is household age. So this tells us the age of the head of the household, and it helps us understand what life stage a household is at in the data. So it helps us distinguish a young couple from a retired couple. Third, there is household ethnicity. Now, ethnicity can influence housing preferences. And last, there's household income. Now, this is the combined earnings of all members of a household, and household income influences the ability to pay for housing and therefore housing affordability. So, in Rotorua district, there was approximately 29,000 households, resident households. And as can be seen from this graph, by far the largest share of households in 2020 was family households. So that's 2 and 1 parent families. So 2 out of every 5 households fall into this category, or around 41%. And then there are couple households in the blue. Just under a third of all district households are couple households. And one-person households, shown in the green, make up about a quarter, or just under a quarter, or 23% of total households. So the data shows also that there's relatively few multi-family households in the district, and only 3% of total households are those flatting together. Now, these patterns are important. It shows the household type structure of the district, and it is the projected changes to this structure that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. We also know from the data that 61% of resident households in 2020 are European, and 26% are Māori. And when we look a little bit deeper in the data, we see that Europeans make up a slightly higher share of couple and one-person households, and vice versa, other ethnic groups make up a slightly higher share of family households. And when we examine the household structure specifically for Māori, Pacifica and Asian households, we see that their structures are in fact quite similar. So we can also bring in the household income patterns for 2020. Looking at this data on its own and in combination with other socio-demographic variables. So in 2020, 37% of Rotorua's households earned less than $50,000 per annum. Compared to the national average, that's slightly higher share. So nationally, 34% of households have incomes less than $50,000. And Rotorua also has a slightly lower share of households with higher incomes. Again, these differences from the national average are quite small. However, the data does show us that Rotorua has a slightly different housing affordability profile, and this highlights that housing solutions in Rotorua need to be tailored to the Rotorua community. As you might expect, when combined with other household type data, one-person and single-parent families tend to have the lower incomes, and households with multiple earners, such as working age couples or two-parent families, and also multi-family households, tend to have the higher incomes. So, what did we find out about how Rotorua's households are housed? First, we know a little bit about the tenure of resident households. Nearly 2/3 of all resident households own their own home. So this includes those with and without a mortgage. The balance, 37%, are in rental properties, and this includes public and social housing. Tenure is particularly relevant to analysing housing affordability. While I don't have time to go into housing affordability in Rotorua today, the approach that we took in that HBA report is how affordable it is for first home buyers to purchase a house, so not those already on the property ladder. So hence the assessment in the HBA applies specifically to that 37% of households that are not homeowners. And rental affordability is also a relevant issue for that group, and that is briefly touched on in that HBA report. We also know a bit about the types of dwellings that are occupied by resident households. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk about standalone dwellings, which are separate houses on their own section. And secondly, I'm going to refer to attached dwellings. Now, attached dwellings are horizontally attached dwelling units, with duplex being the term for two houses, units attached side by side, and terraced housing is a common term that we use for greater than 2 units horizontally attached. There is some of this style in Rotorua currently, particularly in the medium density zone. There is some in retirement villages, but a lot of the housing stock that is attached here in Rotorua is quite old, and there's not a lot of contemporary examples. Sorry, I forgot to click. No. So attached housing also includes vertically stacked dwellings or apartments. Now there are very limited examples of this in Rotorua, despite the larger commercial centre zones enabling apartments above the ground floor. So currently we know that, 88% of total resident households are living in standalone dwellings, and 12%, or around 3,500, are living in attached housing. So these current dwelling stock patterns are influenced by 3 factors. Firstly, it's driven by what households want. This is a balance between housing preferences and housing affordability. Then there is what housing option the district plan allows. Now, the current housing stock of Rotorua is representative not just what's in the current district plan, but it reflects decades of past planning provisions. Then there is what the housing sector, including land developers and housing construction industry, supplies. The housing sector tries to find a balance between what the market wants and what's feasible and profitable to build, all the time working within the planning rules. So here I've provided a bit more detail on housing patterns by looking at the combination of household types and dwelling types. Now these patterns are not really unexpected. All household types are dominated by standalone dwellings, so that's the yellow part of those bars. And this simply reflects what is available to live in Rotorua at the moment. But it is helpful to look at the relative shares in attached housing across the different household types. The household type most likely to live in attached housing, according to 2020 data, is one-person households, with 24% of them living in attached dwellings. And while not shown in this particular graph, one-person households make up 23% of all households, but they make up 45% of all of those living in attached housing. So there really is a strong propensity for one-person households to be in attached homes. The household type least likely to be in attached dwellings is large families with 3 or more children, or flatting households. So generally the more people in the household, the more likely they are to be in a standalone dwelling, which are typically larger than attached houses, although that doesn't need to be the case going forward. So these patterns, which have established over many years of growth and change, offer simple but important guidance as to the future housing needs of Rotorua and their preferences, particularly because different segments of the community are expected to grow at different rates in the future. So let's look ahead 30 years' time to 2050. Current projections indicate that resident households will increase by 27%. That's an additional 7,850 resident households in the district, and it equates to around another 14,400 additional people. Averaged out over the long term, this is about 260 additional households each year, either coming into the district through migration or through natural household formation rates. In fact, that annual growth rate is much faster in the short to medium term, and then it slows down in the long term. So when we talk about an additional 7,850 resident households, the real growth pressure is actually now. So assuming one dwelling per household, that's 7,850 more dwellings needed to keep up with residential household demand. And that does not include the housing shortfall for residential households. Now, for the HBA report, we estimated that the current shortfall in housing sits at around 1,500 dwellings. And so Rotorua not only has to keep up with the future demand growth year on year, but address the shortfall of housing at the same time. And although I have been focusing on the housing demand driven by resident demand, when we factor in the shortfall for housing and the projected growth for dwellings for non-resident households, so the holiday home owners and the Airbnb operators, etc., the total projected housing demand over the next 30 years is estimated to be 9,570 additional dwellings required, so larger again. And around 8,000 of those are estimated to be required in the urban environment. And this is Rotorua's housing challenge. So aside from the total quantum of household growth, we have to look at the nature of that growth to understand the types of housing needed in the future to meet community needs. Now, we know that the population will gradually age. This trend is occurring across most parts of New Zealand. Most, but not all, population age groups will be bigger in 2050 than they are today, although the projections suggest that the number of 15 to 44-year-olds will actually be pretty similar to the number we have now, just 4% more. And there will also be ever so slightly less children, or those under age 15 in the long term. So while the population overall is growing, the number of children is not expected to grow. The key trend in the long term is that older age groups will make up a larger share of the total population. The number of residents aged between 60 and 74 is projected to grow by 24% by 2050. So that's 2,750 more residents in that age group. Now, significantly, the number of residents aged 75 plus is projected to grow by 160%. That's 7,500 more residents aged 75 plus than there are today. So when planning for future household growth, it is easy to see why those strategies need to include planning for retirement villages, care homes, kaumātua and koeki housing, and other housing that is suitable for older residents. The data also shows us that the ethnic structure of households in 2050 will be broadly similar to the ethnic structure today. And this just means that ethnicity alone is not going to be a significant influence on the changing characteristics of future housing. 1 and 2 person households will make up 75% of total residential growth over the long term. Now, in this graph, the black bars represent the scale and mix of households in 2020, and the blue bars show the same thing but in 2050. Now, that increase from the black bar to the blue bar for 1 person households equates to just over 3,100 additional 1 person households. The increase in couple households is nearly 3,000. The increase in total family households is slightly more modest at just under 1,700 more than there are today. Finally, the projected growth is negligible for the number of multifamily and non-family households. This future household structure starts to give you a sense of the sorts of dwellings that need to be delivered over the next 30 years. And with a changing and ageing household structure comes changing structure of household incomes in the long term. It will look different to what we see today. Again, in this graph, the black bars are 2020 and the blue bars are estimates of 2050, with the size of each bar reflecting the count of resident households in each income category, with the income categories increasing as you move up the graph. Now, by 2050, it is projected that just over half of total household growth will be in households that earn less than $50,000 per annum. These households will make up 41% of all households in the future, compared to 37% now. And more specifically, a third of long-term households will earn less than $30,000 a year. These households will make up a third of total households, compared to just a quarter today. Importantly, these patterns are not because incomes per se are dropping, but rather it's driven by there being more retired people in the community who are no longer earning income through wages and salaries. So what does this mean for Rotorua's future housing stock? Well, when we examine this, it's important to look at the demand of total future households and not just the net increase. And this is important because there is typically movement of household types between existing and new housing. An easy example is a retired couple moving out of their family home into a smaller dwelling or retirement unit. So this frees up another family home to help cater for growth in family households. Of course, the more diverse the housing stock, the more opportunities you create for this healthy churn in the housing market, and the better households can meet their changing lifestyle needs. And this is something that Rotorua has not been doing especially well up until now, with housing stock dominated by standalone dwellings on medium to large size sections. So as shown in previous slides, the demand profile for housing will be different in 2050 from what we have now. These structural changes to household types will, however, be gradual, and this gives us time to do something about it today. The increase in the size of household demand is still going to be the greatest driver of change in terms of housing supply going forward. And to model future demand for resident dwellings, in the HBA report, Market Economics adopted the 2020 household to dwelling type relationships and adjusted this going forward based purely on the changing demographic characteristics over time, so the patterns that I've been talking about. But we've also included a small long-term shift in housing preferences towards attached housing to help keep in line with national trends. And because Rotorua has relatively few attached houses currently, including no real established apartment market, we have been conservative in this assumption, as any change to more attached housing will be off quite a low base. So by combining these assumptions, we estimate that those 7,850 additional dwellings needed to meet district-wide resident household demand will need to comprise of nearly 5,300 more standalone homes and nearly 2,600 more attached dwellings. Now, these additions would mean that by 2050, standalone dwellings would make up 83% of the district's housing stock, compared to 88% now, and attached dwellings would make up 17%, compared to 12% today. It's useful to look a little bit closer at the household structure of attached dwellings in the long term under these assumptions. And the changes needed to deliver more attached housing is, I think, the biggest challenge for the Rotorua community to get their heads around. This graph picks up data for 2020 shown earlier and compares it with estimated 2050 outcomes. So it's specifically focused on attached housing. Conservatively, it's estimated that in the long term, 31% of one-person households could be living in an attached dwelling, compared to 24% today, as well as 13% of couple households, compared to 9% today. And with appropriately sized attached housing, we would also expect slightly more family households to be living in attached housing. So as mentioned, these results for 2050 are nearly entirely driven by a continuation of status quo housing patterns in Rotorua. It is likely that the household choices we see in the 2020 data are somewhat constrained by the housing that is available and affordable in the market, and that for some households trade-offs have been made. This is because it's better to have a house that is not the ideal type or size than no house at all. So while the current housing stock may not be a totally accurate representation of housing preferences for the Rotorua community, it is still the starting point from which we must measure change. So having looked closely at future housing demand, a key question addressed in that HBA report was whether the current district plan, combined with the indicative growth areas of the 2018 spatial plan, will deliver sufficient housing capacity over the long term to meet projected demand. The focus in the HBA was on the total housing demand, but in the urban environment and not limited to resident household demand. So this is the demand for around 8,250 additional dwellings, including that current housing shortfall. And the findings were not good. We found potential not only for a shortfall in the number of houses overall, but also a shortfall in the number of attached houses conservatively needed by 2050. But Council and other housing stakeholders are already working towards the solutions for Rotorua's housing issues. I'd finish by saying that it's important to acknowledge that increasing housing supply and the right type of supply is complex, with many wider economic factors at play. The purpose of the HBA report was to focus on what Council can influence and how they can influence positive and sufficient housing supply outcomes. Now, things like the cost of building materials is outside of Council's control, but the amount and type of zoned land and the provisions which control lot sizes, building typologies and dwelling sizes are where Council has a role. A key recommendation to come out of the HBA report is that the planning framework in the district needs to change. And among other things, those changes need to diversify new housing supply in Rotorua, particularly by encouraging more smaller houses and more attached houses. Such changes will have the added benefit of improving the commercial feasibility of housing development in the district, but also improving housing affordability over time. Now, I know that the proposed changes to the district plan and the Council's long-term planning and strategising for housing is the topics of subsequent talks, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
And we'll now move to our second guest speaker for today, who is Nick McNabb. So he's joining us today from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, where he's the Chief Advisor for Systems, Insights and Strategy. So we're very much looking forward to your presentation, and thank you very much for being here. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou everyone. So as Tania mentioned, I'm Nick McNabb and I'm Chief Advisor with Te Tuapapa Kura Kāinga, which is the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. Do I need to step forward? Do I? Yeah. Is that better? Okay, great. Cool. So I'll give you an overview of what the Ministry for Housing and Urban Development is about, how we came about, some of the national objectives that we have, but I want to spend most of the time talking about how that relates to our work with Council and Te Anawa here in Rotorua. Because one of the key things that we are doing as a ministry is working much more closely with local communities, because in the same way that Council don't build houses, the Ministry of Urban Development doesn't build houses either. We set the...
Still. Just speak directly into it.
Okay. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, I'll make sure I don't pull away. Right. So Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, or Te Tuapapa Kura Kāinga, we were established in October 2018, which brought together housing functions from across a number of ministries. Until we were established, there wasn't a single ministry who was responsible for the housing and urban system, and that's the key reason that we were established. I've been working in housing policy for a while now, and one of my reflections has been that while housing affordability was always seen as very important, there's also a range of other things which interact with and need to be traded off against housing. So I would sit around the table with the Ministry for the Environment, the Department of Internal Affairs, Ministry of Transport, and when it came to it, other priorities were often more important for those agencies than housing. So one of the reasons why I'm with the Ministry for Housing and Urban Development is to advocate for housing and really push that voice very strongly and how it interacts with other things. So our role is to be responsible for the overall settings for the system. And as I mentioned, a key way in which we need to do that is by working with communities, working with councils, working with iwis, working with developers. And we're doing that in Rotorua through the place-based partnership, which we set up sort of towards the end of 2019. So key guiding strategy for us is the government policy statement for urban development. So that was published late last year, and that's the first time the government has set out a clear statement about this is what we want from the housing and urban system. So sort of parallels the government policy statement that the Ministry of Transport have, and that guides their investment decisions in the same way this GPS is intended to guide and provide clarity about how the Ministry for Housing and Urban Development will act, what Kāinga Ora's priorities are, and also what our expectations are from other government departments who are acting in the housing space. So I won't go through it in great detail, but in terms of some of the key priorities that we have within this, ensuring that housing is affordable, ensuring that housing is suitable for people, because we know we have a significant problems with housing quality, and also the suitability of housing for people's needs, like accessibility. The sustainability and stability of housing is very important as well, as is really understanding what the particular needs are for particular places, because people live in places, they don't live in a national housing market. So really getting into what makes for strong, thriving communities is a core part of what we're focused on. Supporting iwi-led solutions is a really important part of this as well, because the housing system has failed for Māori and iwi over a very, very long period of time, and that needs to be fundamentally reset. And also another thing that we want to be able to do is refocus housing from being a financial asset to it being a home. And some of the tax changes that were made last year were advanced to achieve that. Alongside the GPS, we also have the Māori housing strategy, Mahi Kai Ora, and this is a lot about how we want to behave. So this is about really valuing the Māori Crown relationship and partnership based on the treaty, and this Māori housing strategy was co-developed with iwi. It's a core part of how we want to be working. We also want to support those Māori-led solutions. This is not about the government coming in with the solution, it's about supporting local solutions and particularly Māori-led solutions. It's about funding for Māori housing, ensuring that support for Māori housing aspirations is also available, and ensuring the system works for Māori in the way that it simply hasn't for a long period of time. And also it's about ensuring sustainability and what sustainability means in a Māori context. So that will pick up in particular development on whenua and the importance of that. So moving on from the sort of high level, what are we here for? I just want to touch on Rotorua's recent context and how we understand the set of issues that are presenting us right now. So as you can see, Rotorua's population was quite stable for quite a long period of time. And then around 2014, things just started to grow. And there's a range of reasons that are driving that. Higher house prices and rents in Auckland, spilling to Hamilton, to Tauranga would be a key part of that. But some of the data that I've looked at, which until 2018 broke this down in a great more detail, showed that there were more people moving to Rotorua from the rest of the country. There were fewer people leaving Rotorua to move to the rest of the country. And similarly in terms of international migration, fewer people were leaving Rotorua to go overseas, and more people arriving in New Zealand were choosing Rotorua as a home. All of those movements weren't particularly large, but cumulatively that gives you the very, very strong growth in population that you've seen, which Rotorua hadn't experienced for a very long period of time. That's played its way into much higher house prices for Rotorua, up 172% since 2015, and the numbers around house prices are just fantastic. If you go back to 2020 across the country, the growth is in the vicinity of 400%. It's massive. But I guess what's interesting here is that the growth has tended to follow the national trend. And the key point here is that interest rates do play a strong role in driving house prices. So what I've got up here is the blue line is house prices, and then the green line is showing what the proportion of income that would be spent on servicing a mortgage for the median income earning household, purchasing the median house on a 30-year mortgage, 20% deposit at the 2-year fixed interest rate at the time. So while we saw very strong growth in house prices between 2019 and presently, those servicing costs didn't change all that much because we saw a massive decline in interest rates. And that uptick in the green line, that's the recent rise in interest rates is increasing those servicing costs, and so prices are probably going to fall away. So interest rates play a big role in terms of explaining what goes on with house prices. Which takes me to rents. And we think rents are a much stronger picture about what's going on with the supply and the demand for housing. So you can see for 15 years, rents grew fairly much in line with incomes in Rotorua, 3% year on year. Then population started growing, and that jumped to 7% growth year on year. And the divergence of those two lines is just so stark. What also has been playing out is that the incentives to build in Rotorua haven't been particularly strong for a period, for quite some time. And so what I'm showing here, it's the ratio of the median price of housing compared to the cost to build a dwelling. So that's just the cost of building the house. It doesn't take account of the land or the infrastructure. So when that ratio is around 1.2, it's not profitable to build houses. It's almost paradox that prices were too low at that point in time relative to the cost of construction. And that's a key reason why consents just never took off in Rotorua until very recently. Another important piece of context here is that Rotorua's had for a while a lot of underlying housing deprivation. So what I'm showing here are figures from the 2018 census that looks at the different types of housing deprivation or unmet housing need. So without shelter is people who are rough sleeping or they are living in substandard housing. The temporary accommodation would be transitional housing, emergency housing, and the sharing accommodation is where people are living in a crowded household but they're not part of the primary household unit. So that's a signal that they are living in a crowded household, and that relationship is quite precarious. And so Rotorua had one of the highest rates across the country of that sharing accommodation. At that particular point in time, reliance on motels, transitional housing wasn't particularly high. But from about 2018, that's when we see very strong growth in the public housing register. And I guess that building up of pressure within the housing market in Rotorua, particularly in the rental market, showing up. We don't have a particularly good and clear explanation about why 2018 was the point in time when that happened. My best explanation would be that the rental market absorbed a lot of population growth until it wasn't able to, and from around 2018 is when you've seen that pressure come out. So while that's been looking back, and that's been quite a grim story, there are some green shoots. So with stronger house price growth in recent years, that has led to a much stronger growth in building consents. And so I've put up again that price cost ratio and building consents. And so as that price cost ratio has got up, it's become more profitable to build housing. We've seen consents take off. And so with that price cost ratio, it's almost like there's a Goldilocks zone. If it's too low, that's problematic. But also if it's too high, that's suggesting it's very profitable to build housing, but something's stopping that from happening. So I want to touch on the key areas where we're working in partnership with Council and Te Arawa in terms of responding to this. So fundamentally, this is a problem around population growth and not enough houses being built. So key areas where we are focused is supporting those in need, which we did through the Rotorua Housing Task Force and a range of other programs that we have in place to sustain people in their current tenancies, but also working with the acute homeless through Housing First. We're also partnering with Māori and iwi to unlock potential on whenua land. Those are still early conversations, but hopefully they will progress quickly. Kāinga Ora is also delivering a large volume of public housing, and recently in the budget, government announced an affordable housing fund, which would look to support affordable housing, affordable rentals to complement that public housing. We're also working closely with Council around infrastructure and planning, which Natalie was talking about before. And I guess the other key thing that we play as the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development and our sort of overview of the overall system is that we're able to pick up the things that we can see not working in Rotorua and find out where we can make changes to national policy. So a lot of what I've learned about what hasn't been working in Rotorua over the last 24 months has sought to influence the government's Housing Acceleration Fund announcement last year. A really strong focus there in infrastructure investment to support the development economics in those places where they're particularly weak. And that informed the priority areas under the public housing plan, where government gave a very clear signal to Kāinga that you need to work really hard to lift your building in these particular places because it is really challenging, and we're not confident the market is going to fill that gap in the near term. So, a key thing that we are working on with Council is around the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and so that was a response. There's a long history to this. The Resource Management Act planning rules have been a constraint for housing for some time, and the National Policy Statement was a clear government direction for councils to enable growth both up and out, and to make sure they're enabling housing development where people want to live. And so that was put in place in late 2020 with key focuses around enabling intensification, ensuring that supply can be responsive to demand, and also supporting that long-term planning, and also taking account of the other key things that we care about in our urban environments like climate change and the like. Yes, with 30 to 40% price increase, or house price increases, the government was looking for opportunities to go significantly further, and that's how we ended up with the medium density residential standard, which was passed last year with bipartisan support. And that does two things. It significantly accelerates the implementation of the National Policy Statement. It requires the large Tier 1 councils to use an independent hearings process to push, to implement their implementation plan, their intensification plan changes. And that means that those will be operative from middle to late next year. The standard process would have been 2024 and sometime after that, depending on appeals. The other key thing that the bill did was introduce the medium density residential standard. So that's the 3 dwellings, 3 stories as of right on each section. And so Rotorua Lakes Council, alongside Te Arawa Lakes and Te Tataua Te Arawa, wrote to the government last year and elected to be in to have those rules applied to them as well. And I'll come on to, for the reason that it provided a very, very quick response in terms of addressing the planning issues that Natalie talked about, and to bring forward those plan changes and also to bring forward development as well. On the medium density standard itself, we did modelling for how this would play out in the main centres, and what we looked at was for those areas that are upzoned, based on the patterns of development that we have seen in the past, what do we think is likely to happen in those areas where they might only be now able to support a single dwelling, but if now they're able to support 3 at 3 levels, what's the development response we might expect to see? And you can see quite significant increases in development and housing supply in those main centres. We haven't done a similar modelling exercise for Rotorua because Rotorua doesn't have the history of this type of development to base it against. And we do expect the impacts to be significant, but probably more at a Rotorua scale. So unlike the main centres, you don't have dense cores with very, very high land prices and very, very high levels of accessibility in concentrated places where you would expect that development to occur. I mean, Rotorua's got pretty good accessibility across the city. You can get to wherever you need to without too much trouble. Speaking relatively here compared to the main centres. So that means we think the development response is likely to be more dispersed and across the city. And so one of the reasons why we as government thought the medium density standard would work well for Rotorua is that it would provide the greatest possible set of development opportunities. And that means that by having that greatest possible set, that means there's just so many more potentially profitable developments that can be taken forward, and that would accelerate the delivery of housing. It also enables Kāinga and other housing providers to deliver much greater yield on the pieces of land that they have, and it also provides a very quick way of responding to this need. The alternative process would have been sometime in 2024 or later that these plan changes would have been made, and that would have pushed out the development response by a couple of years. So the plan changes are supported by a range of other things the government is doing. So through COVID and the Shovel Ready Fund that was established, we're able to allocate funding to the investment in State Highway 30 and stormwater solutions for Ngāti Whakaue tribal lands development up at Whanganui Rise. And Kāinga Ora is working with Council on the final stages of their bid for stormwater investment for the Central City and the Western through the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. Mentioned before that Rotorua is a priority for delivery of public housing, and Kāinga Ora and community housing providers and iwi have 220 homes under development. Because in the scale of need, that's still not enough, but that's so many more homes that are being delivered in Rotorua compared to any other like place. Because many of the issues that Rotorua is seeing in terms of strong population growth, limited development response and strongly growing rents, we see in Tairāwhiti, Taitokarau and Hastings, Napier and other like places. Through the budget last year, a significant amount of funding was allocated to support Māori housing solutions. So as I said, we're in discussions with a number of groups here in Rotorua about how we can use that fund. I mentioned the Affordable Housing Fund, which identifies Rotorua as a priority, and there's a number of Kiwi build developments underway. So I guess stepping back, how I'd characterise our support for Rotorua would be one around infrastructure investment to meet the gaps that council can't meet itself, using government delivery and government funding to deliver housing that the market wouldn't deliver itself, and the planning responses. And coming back to the chart on building consents, we are seeing positive signs, and our key challenge here is to sustain that growth in consents over time. But I would also, I think the things that we have underway will ensure that in the medium to long term, that level of activity will be sustained. But I do just want to note that there will be some bumps along the way in terms of what's going on in the construction sector right now. And I guess that's something that we are very keen to understand. How is this playing out in Rotorua? Because I think what we're hearing about development issues in Auckland and Wellington probably won't play out in the same way in Rotorua. Or if they do, then we want to understand where the similarities and the differences are. So we have seen strong growth in construction costs, and in part that's a response to the very, very significant increase in national consents following the increase in house prices in response to COVID. So we saw a 25% increase in consents nationally over the last 12 months. In the past, the level of building has grown by about 10% year on year. So the ability for the construction sector, for labour to supply that 25% increase just wasn't going to happen. And so that's why you're seeing that rapid inflation. And I guess that comes to my final chart. In part, one of the reasons why the Reserve Bank is putting up interest rates quite sharply to address inflation is because of some of those issues within the construction sector. International issues absolutely playing a key role, but one of the key domestic drivers of interest rates is growth in rents and growth in construction costs. And those combination of growth in construction costs and rising interest rates is going to have a significant impact on that profitability of development. But again, that will pass, and it may be a couple of years before interest rates start to come back again and move back more into a steady state. But as I said, we're very keen to understand what's happening now, what are the risks now, and how do we need to flex what we are doing to respond to that. And there's some further information. In the next few weeks, we're putting up a lot more place-based information onto our website to enable people to better understand how do different districts compare with others. I'd hoped it would be up by the time I was standing here, but not quite.
Any questions?
Any questions?